The north is cold and full of whispers.
The Red Mountains did not care about her. That was the first thing Catelyn understood, 3 weeks into the ride south and 1,000 miles from the nearest river. The riverlands breathed. They moved. Water ran through everything, beneath the soil, between the stones, singing at the edges of every road she had ever traveled. The Dornish foothills gave her none of that. Just heat that didn't know it was evening. Red rock. The kind of silence that had weight. Her horse picked its way down the pass. Ahead, the Blackfish rode without speaking. He had said perhaps 40 words since they crossed the Prince's Pass, and she had not encouraged more. Brynden Tully was not a man who talked when he was thinking, and she needed him to think clearly. 8 of them, in total. Her uncle. Maester Rowan, white-haired and methodical, his saddlebags heavy with willow bark and clean linen, and 3 sealed jars of Tully honey. 5 men-at-arms who had ridden with the Blackfish in the rebellion, and who had, when he told them this journey required silence above all other virtues, looked at him and said nothing, which was the answer he required. And Catelyn. She had not told Ned. There had been no time. There had barely been time to read the letter twice before burning it, before walking to her uncle's rooms and placing the ashes on his table, and watching him read what little remained of the words. Tower of Joy. Red Mountains. The girl is dying. The child is born. The messenger had died before dawn. A man in no house colors, carrying no sigil, no name. He had asked for her specifically, not Hoster Tully, not the Blackfish. Lady Catelyn. He had pressed the letter into her hand with the last serious effort of his life, and then his eyes had simply stopped. She had stood in the corridor of Riverrun for a long time afterward, a dead man at her feet and a burning letter in her hands. Then she made her choice. The tower appeared around the next bend in the track, and her chest tightened. It was smaller than she'd imagined. Stone. Old. The color of the mountains around it. A single window near the top with shutters drawn. No banner, no fire. Nothing that would tell a passing stranger this place had anything inside it worth dying for. The 3 men in the courtyard told a different story. They wore white. Dirty white. The white of long weeks without a washwoman, without a supply line, without anything resembling a base of operations. But it was still white, and the swords at their hips were still real, and Catelyn recognized the insignia on the eldest man's pauldron even at 50 yards. The Kingsguard. The Blackfish's horse stopped. His hand did not go to his sword. Good, the largest of the 3, stepped forward. Old, white-haired, with the bearing of a man who had forgotten how to stand any way other than at attention. Gerald Hightower. The White Bull. Lord Commander of a Kingsguard whose king was 3 weeks in the ground. Behind him, a leaner man watched the tree line with eyes that didn't stop moving. Oswell went. His hand rested on his hilt without gripping it, the posture of someone prepared to move very fast if the moment asked. And in front of both of them, still, unhurried, watching Catelyn specifically and not the Blackfish, Sir Arthur Dayne. She had heard songs about him. Everyone had. The Sword of the Morning. She had expected someone larger. He was perhaps 30, lean in the way that people who had spent their whole lives being genuinely dangerous were lean. The sword on his back, pale scabbard, pale hilt, was exactly what the songs described. He watched her with an expression that was not hostile and not welcoming, and was, most precisely, calculating. The Blackfish began to move his horse forward. Catelyn dismounted. It was the last thing anyone expected. She heard her uncle make a sound behind her that was not quite a word. She heard the soft rasp of Oswell Went's sword moving an inch in its scabbard. She walked between her uncle and Sir Arthur Dayne at a pace that did not hurry, because hurrying was what frightened animals did. And she was not going to be a frightened animal. She stopped 6 feet from Arthur Dayne. "My name is Catelyn Tully," she said. "Lady of Winterfell. I received information about what is inside this tower, and I have ridden 3 weeks to stand here. I have a physician in my party, Tully trained, better than anyone you will find within 300 miles. Dayne looked at her. His expression didn't move. "I know what you're protecting," she said. I am not here because Robert Baratheon sent me. I am not here to take anything from you. I am here because there is a woman dying in that tower, and the child she has delivered cannot be raised by a corpse." "You know nothing of what is in this tower," said Gerald Hightower from behind Dane. His voice was iron plate. "The real thing." "I know the woman's name," Catelyn said. She held his gaze, the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, a man who had served 3 kings, a man to whom most of the world reflexively lowered their eyes. She kept hers level. "I know who the child's father was. I know why all 3 of you are standing in a Dornish courtyard instead of on the Trident." She let that settle into the dust between them. "I also know that a woman in the 3rd stage of childbed fever has perhaps 2 days before the question of who she was becomes irrelevant to everyone." Silence. The Red Mountains had a lot of it to offer. Arthur Dane's hand had been near Dawn for the length of this conversation, not gripping it, near it. He studied her the way commanders studied things that did not fit any category they had prepared for. "You can kill me," Catelyn said. "Sir Arthur. You can kill me, and my uncle will take your head before your body finishes falling, and the woman upstairs will be dead before nightfall, and the child she delivered will be an orphan in a tower with 3 knights who have no kingdom left. Or you can let my physician through." Something moved behind his eyes. Not a decision, exactly, more like a man watching the last viable road reveal itself through a fog he had been standing in for weeks. He stepped aside. The blackfish exhaled, barely, once, and dismounted. The inside of the tower was dim and close and smelled of iron, and underneath the iron. Something that Catelyn's body recognized before her mind had a name for it. The smell of a wound that had been losing its argument with itself for days. She had been at bedsides before. She knew what infection announced. At the top of a narrow stair, in a room that should have been cool at dusk, and was instead, wrongly, feverishly warm. Lyanna Stark lay in linen that had been changed as recently as someone could manage, and not recently enough. She was 16 years old. Catelyn had known this. She had not entirely prepared for what 16 looked like here. In this room, with this much blood and this much silence and this much time having already passed. The face was gaunt and gray, damp at the temples, the dark hair gone lank and tangled across the pillow. She was still beautiful. The kind of beautiful that did not depend on circumstances, that simply was. And she was dying. And she was 16. Lyanna was not looking at her. Lyanna was looking at the bundle in her arms. Behind Catelyn, Maester Rowan was already moving, the sounds of a man who knew precisely what he was doing and had already begun. Bags opening. Jars unsealed, the smell of honey cutting briefly through the iron. Catelyn stepped closer to the bed, and she looked at the child. Dark hair. Gray eyes. She knew those eyes. She had looked into those eyes across a table and across a courtyard and across every quiet morning in Winterfell that she and her husband had spent learning what kind of distance still existed between them. The particular gray of them. She had learned that gray. It was her husband's gray, in the face of a child who was not her husband's. Lyanna Stark looked up at her, the focus of a candle burning its last reserves, fierce and specific and aimed. She held out the child. No words. No question. The most deliberate thing Catelyn had ever seen a body do in the last hours of its strength. "I cannot hold him and survive this. So you will hold him." Catelyn took the baby. She felt the small, impossible weight of him settle against her chest. His heat. The miniature insistence of a living thing that did not yet know what world it had been born into the middle of. She looked at Sir Arthur Dane, standing in the doorway with his hand at his side and his white cloak gone the color of old ash. She said nothing. He said nothing. The silence settled between them like a stone being placed in a wall, carefully, deliberately. In the knowledge that it would have to hold weight for a very long time, the pact had no words. It didn't need them. It had a child. Rowan did not speak while he worked. That was the first thing Catelyn had learned about him, years before this tower and this room and this smell, that silence was how he concentrated, and interrupting it was something you only did once. He moved around the bed with the economy of a man who understood that unnecessary motion cost a patient time they might not have. He checked the birth wound. He pressed 2 fingers to Lyanna's wrist. He lifted one eyelid with a careful thumb, looked at what was underneath, and let it fall. He did these things, and his face told Catelyn almost nothing, which was the most alarming thing he could have done. Outside the door she could hear Sir Arthur Dayne's breathing. Just the breathing. No movement. He had positioned himself in the corridor and stayed there, and something about the absolute stillness of him made Catelyn more aware of her own heartbeat than she would have liked. Rowan straightened and turned to her. "Stage 2, he said quietly. "Close to 3. The wound is infected, 3 days in, possibly 4. Her fever is 39 at minimum." He glanced at the window. The birth itself appears to have been clean. Someone knew what they were doing, or got fortunate. The infection came after. "Can you treat it?" Not a question. He understood this about her. "With what I have, in these conditions, with the time remaining?" He touched the sealed jar at his belt. "I have treated worse. I have also lost worse." He held her gaze without apology. "I will work." She nodded once and stepped back. He boiled the linen first. There was a fire in the room's small hearth that the Kingsguard had kept burning through the weeks of waiting, and Catelyn fed it while Rowan worked the cloth through water she watched until it reached the right temperature. The honey came out of the Tully jars, thick and amber and smelling of clover and riverbank and home. Vinegar, willow bark, stripped and steeped in boiling water until the liquid went the color of weak tea. Milk of the poppy, measured with the glass rod Rowan kept in a separate case, because broken glass in a saddlebag was the kind of mistake you only made once. He packed the wound. He forced the vinegar where it needed to go. Lyanna made no sound. She was too deep in the fever for sound, but her hands clenched the blanket, and her jaw tightened, and Catelyn, watching from the foot of the bed, understood that whatever the poppy was doing, it was not enough. She moved to the head of the bed. She took Lyanna's hand. She didn't think about it. She simply did it. The Kingsguard came to the doorway in shifts through the night. She never heard them trade off. They moved with a professional quiet that she found herself cataloging in the cool part of her mind that did not stop observing even when the rest of her was afraid. Oswell Went watched the bed. Arthur Dayne watched Catelyn. She understood the distinction. Went was guarding what the child represented. Dayne was assessing the architect of a situation he hadn't anticipated and wasn't sure how to classify. She let him look. She had nothing to hide here that he could not already see. The fever spiked in the small hours. Lyanna's breathing changed, shallower, faster, the sound of a body burning reserves it could not afford. Rowan was beside her immediately, cold cloths to her wrists, her throat, the thin skin behind her ears. He moved with the hurried calm of a man who had done this before, and knew that panic cost the same time as speed, and produced none of the results. Catelyn brought water, over and over, through the dark. Broth from a pot the Tully men had made from their provisions. She did not sleep. The baby slept in the crook of her arm while she worked. She had not put him down since Lyanna handed him to her. There were practical reasons for this that she told herself clearly and repeatedly. Rowan needed her hands free. The child needed to be kept warm. The Kingsguard could not be asked to hold him. She did not examine the other reasons. Lyanna came back to herself somewhere in the gray early morning. Not all the way. Enough, her eyes opened, and she turned her head on the pillow, and she found the room with the particular searching look of someone checking whether they were still in the right world. Then she found Catelyn. She studied her for a long moment. "Who are you?" Her voice was scraped clean. Almost nothing. "Catelyn Tully." She leaned forward in the chair beside the bed. "Lady Stark now." Something moved across Lyanna's face. "Ned's wife." "Yes." A pause. Her gaze moved to the child in Catelyn's arms, and the whole quality of her changed, every remaining piece of strength redirecting itself the way a fire draws on its last wood. "He's alive. He's sleeping. He ate 3 hours ago." Lyanna closed her eyes. The relief that moved through her was visible even beneath the fever, even beneath the hollowness. It went all the way down into her. "Then, is Ned coming?" "He doesn't know I'm here. He'll come when the fighting's done." She kept her voice even. "He'll come to the tower. But you won't be dead when he gets here. So we have time." Lyanna opened her eyes again. They were gray and direct and, underneath everything the fever had done to them, genuinely sharp. She was her brother's sister. The resemblance was not in the face, it was in the quality of looking. "You came for him," she said. Catelyn did not answer immediately. She didn't know, in that moment, who Lyanna meant. And Lyanna did not clarify. The sentence settled between them and held its shape. "Sleep," Catelyn said. "Rowan will be back within the hour." She saw the roses properly for the first time in the morning light. 6 of them, on the bedside table. Long dead, shrunk into gray paper and dried wire, the color gone to the bruised shadow of what they had been. They had been blue once, vividly, improbably blue. The color of a Winterfell summer that came once a decade, if the season was generous. She knew about the roses. Everyone who had attended the tournament at Harrenhal knew about the roses. The mystery knight who had unhorsed 3 of the finest in the realm. The crown of winter roses placed, not on the queen of love and beauty the realm expected, not on any of the high-born women in their silks, but into the lap of a girl of 14 who looked up at the man placing them and did not look away. Catelyn picked one up. The petals held together only because they had dried where they fell, sheltered from the wind by the tower walls. She turned it in her fingers. Rhaegar Targaryen had not stolen Lyanna Stark. She stood in the room where the evidence had been accumulating for days. The infant with his Stark eyes, the roses kept through weeks of siege and illness, the quality of fierce and private grief in a girl who did not look like a prisoner, and she understood it completely. The way you understood things when your mind finally stopped arguing with what your eyes had been telling it. He had loved her. She had chosen him. And they had made a decision, together, privately, in whatever moment it had been made, that the rest of the world was currently burning itself down over, in a war that had already killed thousands of people who had no part in the choosing. She set the rose back beside the others. She picked up the water basin and went to help Rowan. Hour 36. The fever broke the wrong direction. It spiked, past what it had been, past the ceiling Rowan had named the previous night. Lyanna went very still, and the quality of the stillness was different from sleep, different from unconsciousness. It had a direction to it that Catelyn felt in her hands before she understood it in her mind. She gripped Lyanna's hand. Rowan was already moving. Cloths, cold water, the specific controlled urgency of a man who had been at this edge before and knew there was exactly one thing to do, and no time to feel the weight of doing it. Catelyn heard Dane take a step into the room behind her. She did not turn around. She watched Lyanna breathe. Watched the fire in the hearth settled into itself. Outside, the red mountains were going from black to the first dark red of dawn. And then, so gradually it might have been an argument rather than a fact, the fever began to let go. Not a moment, not a turn, just the long, reluctant shift of something that had been going one direction choosing, incrementally, to go another. The burning quality under Catelyn's palm softened. Lyanna's breathing slowed. The wrongness that had been in the room for 36 hours began, not to leave, but to thin. Lyanna's eyes opened. They were exhausted. They were clear. They were her own. She lay still for a moment, taking the room's inventory. Then she looked at Catelyn. "His name," she said. "Barely there. But steady." Rhaegar chose it. Before, she stopped. Started again. Aegon. He wanted to call him Aegon. Catelyn said nothing. Something crossed Lyanna's face. Grief and love and cold practicality, in proportions that shifted as Catelyn watched. "Not here," Lyanna said. "Not now. Not in this world. Not that name." She looked directly at Catelyn, and the gray of her eyes was the same gray as her brother's, the same gray as the child sleeping 3 feet away. "Give him a name that keeps him alive." Catelyn looked at the child. Dark hair, gray eyes, every line of him a Stark. "Your brother will choose," she said. "When he comes." Lyanna said nothing. She closed her eyes. But she did not let go of Catelyn's hand. He had been rehearsing her death for 3 weeks. That was the truth of it. The thing Ned Stark had not said to any of the 6 men riding with him, because there was no useful way to say it. He had rehearsed it on the road south through the Reach. He had rehearsed it sleeping, and not sleeping in roadside inns that smelled of someone else's war. He had rehearsed the shape of the grief until he thought he knew it precisely, knew its dimensions, knew how much of him it would take, knew the particular way the North would feel when he rode home without her. Lyanna was going to be dead when he got there. He had allowed himself to know this the way you allowed yourself to know a blade was coming, not bracing for it, because bracing shattered things. Just knowing. Just opening the door to the knowledge and leaving it open so the cold could come in slowly instead of all at once. The Red Mountains offered nothing. Red stone, red dust, the smell of heat that had been building since morning. The 6 men behind him, Howland Reed, Lord Dustin, Ethan Glover, Martin Castle, Theo Wool, Mark Ryswell, had stopped talking yesterday. And Ned had not noticed when they stopped, because he had stopped listening before that. Ice was across his back. The weight of it was the most familiar thing in his life. The track bent, and the tower came into view. 3 white cloaks. His hand was moving to ice before his mind caught up with why. He had known it would be them. In the part of his mind that had been quietly building this moment since he first understood where Lyanna was, he had known there would be Kingsguard at the end of the road. Men he respected. Men who would make him earn every step, and who he would have to kill, and who would make dying look like the simplest transaction in the world. He recognized Gerald Hightower first, the posture of him, the white hair, the absolute refusal to be anything other than what he was even in a Dornish courtyard, with no kingdom left to serve. Then Oswell went, watchful and still. Then Arthur Dayne, and the sight of him did something to Ned's chest that was not precisely fear, and was not precisely admiration, and was the particular combination of the two that only Arthur Dayne produced in anyone who had ever stood across from him. Ned kept riding. At 20 yards he pulled up. The Kingsguard said nothing. Behind Ned his men fanned out. Not a charge, not a retreat. The instinctive spread of men who had been in enough battles to know how to fill a yard. Howland Reed's pony stopped directly at Ned's left. Ned could feel Reed watching everything. Gerald Hightower opened his mouth. The tower door opened. Catelyn Stark walked into the courtyard. The world made no sense for the length of time it took her to cross the ground between the door and his horse. Ned's mind tried several approaches to this information, and discarded all of them. His wife was in River Run. His wife was 3 weeks' hard ride north. His wife was carrying their unborn child, and had no possible reason to be standing in a Dornish courtyard in travel-dusty Tully blue. Walking toward him with the expression of someone who had been waiting for him to arrive, and had a great deal to say about how long it had taken. She put her hand on his horse's neck. She looked up at him. "She's alive, Ned," she said quietly. "Come inside." He dismounted. He was not conscious of deciding to do it. He heard rather than felt his boots hit the ground. The 6 men behind him had gone absolutely silent, the silence of soldiers who had been ready for a fight to the death, and now found themselves in a situation with no category. Howland Reed made no sound. But Ned felt him watching. The Kingsguard did not move. Ned looked at Arthur Dayne, and Dayne looked back at him, and neither of them spoke. Something had already happened in this courtyard. Some version of this standoff had already been had without him, and the result of it was his wife walking out of the tower to meet him, which meant the result had not been swords. Catelyn touched his arm. He went inside. She was not dead. That was the only thought he had, climbing the narrow stair behind his wife. For the length of time it took to reach the room at the top, some fixed part of him that had been braced against what it expected to find kept receiving the same information and failing to integrate it. She was not dead. He had been so certain. The room was warmer than the rest of the tower and smelled of honey and vinegar and wood smoke, and underneath all of it, the iron smell of weeks of illness that no amount of fresh linen fully covered. A white-haired man he did not know was packing instruments into a leather case by the window. He glanced at Ned without surprise and went back to the packing. The bed was against the far wall. Lyanna was in it. She was thin. Thinner than he had ever seen her. The Lyanna he'd left at Winterfell 2 years ago had been 16, and alive in the way that particular kind of 16 was alive, all coiled energy and opinion, and the specific refusal to accept any situation as settled. This woman in the bed looked like someone had taken that girl and burned away everything that wasn't essential, leaving what remained stripped to the core. But her eyes were open. And when she found him standing in the doorway, they did what Stark eyes did, which was sharpen. "You're late," she said. Her voice was scraped down to almost nothing, but the cadence of it was hers, the dry precision she had wielded since childhood, the tone that suggested she had formed an assessment of the situation and found it wanting. Ned crossed the room. He sat on the edge of the bed and took her hand, and for a moment neither of them spoke. He looked at her. She looked at him. Two people who had grown up in the same cold house with the same cold father and who understood each other in the specific wordless way that only came from sharing a childhood. The grief he had been carrying for 3 weeks had nowhere to go. It didn't leave. It just became something else, something with less certainty about its own shape. "Cat wrote to no one," he said finally. "Not an accusation, just the fact of it, the piece that didn't fit." "She didn't have to," Lyanna said. "She made a decision." He looked at his wife. Catelyn was standing by the window with her back to the glass, and she was holding a child he had known. Not consciously, not in a way he had named or spoken or even fully formed, but in the deep structural part of a mind that built understanding from architecture rather than words. He had known what the truth of this tower was from the moment he first understood where Lyanna had gone and with whom. He had known it and sealed it under everything else, because knowing it changed nothing about what he had to ride toward. He stood. He crossed to his wife. The child was dark-haired and sleeping with the total unconcerned commitment that newborns managed, which always looked to Ned less like peace and more like profound indifference to the world's opinion of them. His hands were curled. His face, in sleep, was fully Stark, the bones of it, the particular set of the jaw. And then he shifted and opened his eyes for a moment in the way sleeping infants did, and the gray of them was his sister's gray, and his own gray, and the gray of every Stark who had looked out at the north from the windows of Winterfell since the Age of Heroes. Ned looked at the child. He looked at Catelyn. She met his gaze without flinching. "He needs a name," she said. Her voice was level and private and entirely serious. One that works. He understood what she meant. He understood all of it. The mechanics of what would have to be claimed and denied, the story that would need to be told and then never deviated from, the particular cruelty of what a name could cost a child, and what the absence of the right name could cost him instead. He looked back at his sister. Lyanna was watching him. The fierce thing in her, the thing the fever had not touched, was present and direct and making no argument. She had already had this argument, clearly. She had already made this decision. What she was offering him now was not consent so much as the acknowledgement that the decision required his voice on it. He looked at the child one more time. Dark hair. Gray eyes. Every surface of him northern. A boy who would grow up with the wind off the Winterfell walls in his face and the particular silence of the crypts in his bones, and who would never know that somewhere in the architecture of himself was a dead prince and a secret marriage, and the claim to a throne that had already drowned the realm in blood. "Jon," Ned said. The name came without ceremony, without the weight he'd expected. Just the name, settling into the room like something that had always been waiting. Jon Snow. Lyanna's jaw tightened. Not refusal, not grief, precisely, the tightening of something accepted rather than wanted, the small, precise cost of a decision that had already been made. She closed her eyes. She did not let go of Ned's hand. The naming changed nothing about the 3 men outside. Catelyn understood this clearly. Whatever had happened in that room, the fever breaking, the child named, Ned sitting beside a sister he had ridden south to bury, none of it touched the fundamental problem still standing in the courtyard with white cloaks and drawn patience and nowhere left to go. She left Ned with Lyanna. She went downstairs. The 3 Kingsguard were where she expected them. Hightower near the door, went by the window watching the pass. Dane at the table, not sitting, one hand flat on the wood, the posture of a man who had been awake too long and was not going to show it. "I need an hour," she said. "All 3 of you." Upstairs, Hightower looked at her. Lady Stark. Sir Gerald. The title landed precisely, and she watched him register it. She was not using courtesy. She was using the man's name to remind him that she knew exactly who he was and what he had been, and that this conversation was going to happen between people who understood each other's weight. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he moved toward the stairs. Went followed. Dane came last, and as he passed her, he said nothing, which was the kind of nothing that meant he had already decided something. The room was tight, with all of them in it. Ned was standing by the bed. The Blackfish had materialized from wherever he had been and positioned himself near the window with the complete lack of fanfare that was his particular talent. Rowan had stepped to the far corner, instruments repacked, hands folded. The face of a man who knew when his role in a situation had changed. Lyanna was sitting up. Not fully. The effort of it was visible, the careful distribution of weight, the slight tension in her jaw that was pain, managed rather than absent. But she was upright, and Jon was in the crook of her arm, and she was watching the three men who had guarded her door for weeks with an expression that Catelyn could not entirely read. Gerald Hightower looked at her across the room. Some old and private acknowledgment passed between them, the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard and the woman he had spent weeks keeping alive without knowing whether he was doing her any kindness. Then he looked at Catelyn. "Speak," he said. She had ordered her argument on the road south and again in the long hours of Lyanna's fever, and she had refined it further in the quiet after the naming. Standing at the window, watching the red mountains go gold. She did not pace. She stood in the center of the room. "Rhaegar Targaryen is dead," she said. "Arys Targaryen is dead. Robert Baratheon holds the Iron Throne, and he holds it absolutely, because there is no competing claim with an army behind it." She paused. "There is a competing claim in this room. And every hour it remains known to more than 5 people, it becomes more likely to kill the child it belongs to." Hightower said nothing. "Robert already murdered Elia Martell's children," she said. "Aegon was 8 months old. He was murdered because of who his father was. This child is older than Aegon was. She let that sit for precisely the time it needed. Your vow is to protect the king. I am telling you that the only way to protect this king is to make every person in Westeros believe there is no king to protect." "The Kingsguard does not hide," Hightower said. His voice was flat granite. "We do not skulk. We do not pretend. A Kingsguard knight stands where he stands, and is what he is. If Eddard Stark wants my head for it, he can try to take it." He meant it. That was the difficulty. He was not posturing. He was a man for whom the form of a thing was indistinguishable from its substance, and the form of what she was asking was dishonorable, and the form of dying at Ned Stark's hand while the white cloak was still clean was not. Ned took a step forward. Catelyn held up one hand. Barely a gesture. He stopped. She looked at Hightower. "You have one purpose left," she said. "One. The child in that bed. Every other purpose you carried is gone. Rhaegar is gone. Arys is gone. The throne you served is occupied by a man who would gut this infant with his own hands if he knew the child existed." She held the Lord Commander's gaze. "I am not asking you to be less than what you are. I am asking you to understand that what you are is a shield. And right now the only question worth answering is what you are willing to stand in front of." "No," said Hightower. She had anticipated this. She had one argument left, and it was not hers to make. She looked at him steadily. "The vow is to the king," she said. "I understand that. The king has no voice. He has no named regent. Rhaegar is dead. Arys is dead. The small council serves a new king entirely. There is no formal authority in this room to appoint a regent for a child whose existence the world does not know about." She paused. "The boy's mother is the only person present with any claim to speak in his name. That is not the form you would choose. I understand that. But it is the only form that exists." Hightower's jaw was set. He said nothing. Then Lyanna spoke. Not loudly. She did not have loudly available to her yet. But she had enough. the particular carrying quality of a voice that had been trained since childhood in the acoustics of a great hall. "Sir Gerald." He turned. She was looking at him from the bed with the baby in her arms and 16 years on her face, and something considerably older in her eyes. She had been listening to all of it. She had been listening, and she had let Catelyn lay the argument because the argument needed laying, and now she said the thing that Catelyn had not said, because it was not Catelyn's to say. "He is my son. His name is Jon." She held the Lord Commander's gaze across the room with the same flat steadiness he had been offering everyone else. "I am telling you, as his mother, as the only regent this king has or will have, to do what this woman says." Hightower was still. The vow. It moved through the room without anyone speaking it. They all understood it. You served the king. The king was an infant. The infant had no named regent, no small council, no formal authority above this room. The king's mother had given an order, in the only form available in a tower at the end of the world, with 3 dead kings and no successor. He bowed his head. Once, slightly, it cost him something she could see. "The terms," he said to Catelyn. 3, she said. "Dane first." He was watching her with the particular attention of a man who had already guessed most of what was coming, and was evaluating the parts he hadn't. "You ride to Starfall," she told him. "You return dawn to your house. You say your goodbyes." She paused. Then Arthur Dane ceases to exist. The Sword of the Morning is a dead man with songs written about him, and the man who carries his name in his face goes somewhere quiet and stays there. No Kingsguard, no white cloak, no sword for hire, nothing that could be traced backward. She met his eyes. "You earned that. A life after this. I am offering you one." Dane said nothing for a long moment. Then, "And my sword?" "Buried with the legend. Dig it up in 30 years if the world looks different." He held her gaze. Something moved behind his eyes that was not acceptance, but was the thing that came just before it. She turned to Went. "Sir Oswell." She held his gaze evenly. "You have family at Harrenhal. Which means Harrenhal cannot hide you, not from the people who would recognize you, and not from yourself." She paused. "Across the narrow sea. The free cities are full of men who were something else before they arrived, and no one asks what they were. Bravos, Pentos, somewhere with enough population that a single Westerosi man with good bearing and no name is unremarkable. You build a life there. You stay. You do not come back." Went looked at the floor, then at the wall, then at the window. Then he nodded. "High Tower last." She chose her words carefully. "The wall," she said. "The Night's Watch has no memory. It asks no questions about the man before the black. It is the oldest honor left in the realm for a man who cannot be what he was and will not be something lesser." She let him consider it. "You are Lord Commander of a Kingsguard with 1 member left and no king to show for it. The Watch needs commanders. It needs men who know what duty costs." She paused. "It is the most honorable thing I can offer you." Gerald Hightower looked at her for a long time. "You have thought about this considerably," he said. "I thought about it on the road south," she said. "I had 3 weeks. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth. Not exactly. The grudging acknowledgement of one serious person for another. "The price," he said. "You said 3 terms. That is the price to us. What do you want in return?" She looked at Ned. Ned looked at her. "Everything," she said. "All of it. The marriage, the name, every word Rhaegar said, every document he left, every oath he swore, and every vow he made. Lord Stark carries this secret for the rest of his life, and he can only carry it accurately if he knows exactly what it is." Hightower turned to Ned, and he told him. The annulment first. The High Septon of Old Town had dissolved Rhaegar's marriage to Elia Martell before the Tower of Joy, the document carried by Arthur Dane on his person through the war and into the Tower, the High Septon's seal intact, witnessed and recorded in a Dornish sept, irrefutable to any maester who examined it. Rhaegar had not taken a second wife while married to Elia. He had ended one marriage legally before beginning another. Then, the marriage itself, a small sept in the hills near Harrenhal's shadow, a septon sworn to silence, Rhaegar and Lyanna alone, except for 2 witnesses who had since died in the war. Legal, binding, recorded in the document Dane now placed on the table between them. Then the name. Aegon, what Rhaegar had chosen for his son and heir. Then the legitimacy. What it meant. What the child sleeping in Catelyn Stark's arms actually was, under the law of the faith, under 3 centuries of Targaryen succession. Under every legal and religious framework that Westerosi civilization had built, around the question of who held the right to the Iron Throne. Hightower gave it plainly, without embellishment, in the way of a man reporting to a superior officer. He was thorough, because thoroughness was the only thing he had left to offer. Ned stood very still through all of it. When Hightower finished, Ned looked at his nephew. He looked at the child for a long time. Then he said, "I understand." That was all. The inn was in the Riverlands. 8 weeks in. A Piper hold, small, managed by a woman who had known the Blackfish since the early part of the rebellion, and who locked the front door when their party arrived and did not reopen it until morning. Ned was asleep, or performing sleep with the practiced dedication of a man who understood when he was not needed. The Blackfish was outside. Rowan was reviewing his notes by the kitchen fire. Willa had taken Jon for the night. Lyanna was sitting at the table by the window with her hands around a cup of something warm, and her eyes on the dark beyond the glass. Catelyn sat across from her. The fire was low. The inn was quiet. "Why did you come?" Lyanna said. Not hostile. She had been building toward the question for weeks, Catelyn could tell, had been carrying it and waiting for the right conditions, the way Starks did. To the tower. "Why you?" "I received the letter. Anyone could have received the letter. Sent a message. Sent a faster rider with better instructions." She turned from the window and looked at Catelyn directly. "Why did you ride 3 weeks into Dorne with a physician and no guarantee I'd still be breathing when you got there?" Catelyn looked at the fire. She could give the answer she had given herself on the road south, in the functional hours when she had needed a reason that had clean edges. It was even true. "For my children's future," she said. A war over a living Targaryen would have no end. Not 1 year, not 5 years. Robert would spend the rest of his reign hunting every rumor. Every lord with a grievance would wave a silver-haired claimant at every other lord. My children would be born into it. Robb, the ones after him. She looked back at Lyanna. Jon alive and hidden is one secret. Jon alive and known is a war that lasts a generation. Lyanna held her gaze. "That's the reason you've told yourself. It's a reason. It's true. It's not all of it." Catelyn was quiet. "You were 16, she said finally. "And dying. And you had just delivered a child in a tower in the middle of a mountain range with 3 soldiers and no physician and no one from your own family who knew where you were." She picked up her own cup. "And you deserved a physician." She paused. "That's all. You deserved a physician. And I had one. And I chose to bring him." Lyanna looked at her for a long time. She didn't thank her. Catelyn had not expected thanks. She did not need it. What she saw instead, moving through Lyanna's expression and settling there, was something more durable than gratitude, the particular shift of a person who has decided another person is exactly what they appear to be. She trusted her. From this moment forward, the neck announced itself the way it always did, the air changing first, going green and thick and wet in a way that had no equivalent south of it. Then the ground softening. Then the smell of standing water and peat, and the specific ancient patience of the crannigs. Lyanna had the carriage window open again. She was watching the land change with the full attention of someone who had not seen the north in 2 years, and was not going to pretend that was a small thing. Jon was awake in her lap, looking at the light through the window with the inscrutable focus of a child of 10 weeks who had opinions about brightness. He made a sound. It was not a cry and not a syllable. It was something in between, a soft, sudden exhalation of what might have been interest, or surprise, or just the random output of a small person whose lungs were learning what they could do. Lyanna looked down at him. Her face did something that had no name and needed none. She held him tighter, briefly, just the length of a breath. Then, she looked back out the window at the neck, at the path north, at the place she was going home to without coming home. She did not speak. Jon looked at the light. The gates opened at midnight. This was Catelyn's doing. She had sent a rider 3 days ahead, a Tully man, tight-lipped, carrying a letter in her own hand addressed to Sir Roderick Cassel. The letter said only that Lady Stark was returning with a ward requiring rest and discretion, and that Lord Stark's household would please arrange a quiet arrival for a small party. Sir Roderick was at the gate himself. He was a man of perhaps 50, gray-whiskered, solid, with the patient competence of someone who had been making Winterfell work for 2 decades and had developed a specific tolerance for his lord's unusual requests. He looked at the carriage. He looked at Catelyn on horseback beside it. He looked at the Blackfish, who looked back with the kind of expression that ended questions before they formed. "My lady," Roderick said. "The ward will need the southwest guest chambers," Catelyn said. "Private, 1 servant. I'll name her in the morning." "Aye, my lady." He asked nothing else. They brought the carriage inside. Lyanna stepped into the inner courtyard of Winterfell. She had expected something. The specific weight of familiarity, the smell of the place at night, the warmth rising from the hot springs beneath the stone, the particular darkness that gathered between the towers. She had grown up inside these walls. Every cobble was memorized. It felt nothing like she expected. This was not the homecoming she had spent 16 years learning to imagine. There was no torchlit hall, no family, no direwolf bounding across the yard. There was a dark courtyard and a Tully man holding the carriage door, and her sister-in-law on horseback counting sightlines to the ramparts. She pulled her hood up. She went inside. The southwest guest chambers were warm with the work of the hot springs running through Winterfell's walls, the castle's particular gift. The thing that made it survivable in a way no other northern seat quite managed. Catelyn spread a map of the lower passages on the table. Ned stood at one end, the Blackfish at the other, Catelyn at the center. 3 choices, she said. The first, she stays here, a room with a name and a fiction attached to it. The fiction is a distant Stark cousin, Lady Serana, White Harbor branch, a widow in poor health. She traced the southwest wing with 1 finger. The problem is servants, kitchen access, laundry, maintenance, too many eyes moving through this part of the castle. She moved her finger down. The second, the Wolfswood Holdfast, a day's ride, isolated, defensible, simple to keep quiet. She looked at Ned. The problem is distance. If the passes close through winter, access becomes difficult, and it leaves her completely alone. She looked at the third thing on the map. Not a room. A passage. The third, she said. Winterfell's lower crypts run further than the family vault. There are passages in the oldest section that haven't been used since the time of the Kings of Winter. The stone down there is warm. The spring vents run close to the eastern wall. There is a room. A heating alcove. The builders used it when they were working the passage through. She paused. It connects to the crypts through a passage that currently only Ned and the master builder know exists. Silence. "You want to put her in the crypts," the Blackfish said. "I want to put her somewhere she cannot be accidentally found," Catelyn said. "The crypts are the one place in Winterfell where no servant goes without specific instruction, where no guest wanders." She looked at Ned. "It is not a prison. She can come up at night." The passage opens into the old armory, empty after dark. She can move, breathe, see sky. She kept her voice level. But she cannot be seen. Ned looked at the map for a long time. Then he looked at Lyanna. She was standing at the narrow window. She had not spoken since they came inside. She was looking at the courtyard below, at the place she knew and could not claim, at the life she was about to live 5 feet beneath it. "I'll take the third," she said. "They built the door in a week." Ned brought in the master builder alone, gave him the commission without explanation, and the man did what Winterfell's people had always done with Stark requests, nodded, measured, asked no questions about purpose. He fitted a door into the heating alcove's existing arch and sealed the join so well that the existing stone seemed to swallow it. Catelyn furnished the room herself. A bed, a writing table, a chair with cushions she brought from her own sitting room and replaced without comment the next morning. Candles, good ones, the slow-burning kind from Riverrun, not tallow. A fire grate vented through the old spring shaft, books from Winterfell's library, chosen by the Blackfish, who chose better than anyone gave him credit for. She set a single blue winter rose on the writing table, dried, from the tower. She had carried it in her saddle pack the entire journey north. She did not explain it. Lady Serana began her tenure in the southwest guest chambers that same week. She was quiet. She was unwell. She took her meals privately, received no visitors, and required only one servant, a woman named Mira. Originally from White Harbor, chosen because she was honest, discreet, and had no family connections to anyone at Winterfell who might ask questions. Mira knew she served a lady who wanted privacy. That was all she was told. The southwest chambers became a detail of the castle, the kind of small, persistent fact that a household absorbed and filed and did not interrogate. A sick cousin of the Starks. Something to feel mildly sorry about and mention to no one, because Lady Stark had made the household's expectation of discretion quietly but completely clear. Winterfell had a long practice of keeping its own counsel. It kept this one too. Catelyn brought Jon down for the first time when he was 3 weeks at Winterfell. Past midnight. The castle quiet in the way large stone buildings went quiet, not silent, but internal. All its sounds turned inward, the creak and breathe of the structure itself rather than the people inside it. She carried him through the old armory and into the passage and through the concealed door with the careful efficiency of someone who had rehearsed the route 3 times in daylight. The alcove was warm. Lyanna was awake. She was always awake when Catelyn came. She never asked how Catelyn knew when she was awake, and Catelyn never explained. She simply came once a week in the hours after midnight, and Lyanna was always sitting in the chair by the candles with a book she had not been reading. She took Jon without speaking. The way she held him had changed. In the tower it had been the fierce, effortful grip of a woman holding on to something with the last of her strength. Here it was different. Quieter, she held him with the terrible ease of someone who had learned exactly how to hold a particular person, and who understood the precise limits of where that knowledge could take them. Catelyn left after an hour. She came back at dawn. Lyanna was always finished by then. The chair was empty, the candles lower, Jon sleeping in Catelyn's arms as she lifted him from the small pallet Lyanna kept beside her bed. The books on the table were sometimes in different positions, sometimes open to pages Catelyn could not help but notice. She never asked what Lyanna read in the dark, alone in the vault beneath the castle. She never asked what it was like to hear her son's voice, growing, changing, week by week, only through 14 feet of stone. Some questions were not for asking. She found the carving on the 6th week. In the stone of the alcove wall, at the height of a seated person's hand. Cut deep and careful, the letters practiced. The old tongue distinct enough from common that Catelyn did not read it on sight. She had the Blackfish translate it. He stood in the passage outside and looked at the 3 words and was quiet for a long moment. The candle in his hand did not move. "The North remembers," he said. He handed the candle back. Neither of them spoke of it again. But Catelyn, the next time she came down past midnight and handed Jon to the woman who had carved it, looked at the wall for a moment before she sat. 3 words in stone. Not grief, not what the songs would have called heartbreak or sacrifice, or the cost of love. Something older than any of those, the specific thing a person carved when they understood that memory was the only form of truth that could not be taken from them. She sat. Lyanna held her son. The hot springs moved through the walls around them, with a sound like deep, slow breathing. The castle above went on not knowing. The ravens came 12 days ahead. The king's party. 200 riders, the message said. Cersei Lannister. The royal children. Half the court. Catelyn read the letter at her writing table, folded it carefully, set it down, and sat for a moment with her hands flat on the wood. Then she called for the Blackfish. He was at Winterfell for the winter, nominally a visit, actually the periodic inspection he had made every few years since 283 AC. The check that served no purpose anyone in the castle could name, except that Lady Stark seemed to find his presence useful and Lord Stark did not object. He came into her solar and read the letter without touching it, which was his habit. Then he looked at her. "The Wolf's Wood," he said. "Tonight," she said. She went down to the alcove herself. 15 years had changed the room in small ways. The chair had been replaced twice. The current one was northern oak, wide, with a cushion Lyanna had sewn herself in the long winter of 291 AC, when she had run out of books and needed something for her hands. There were more books, an ink-stained table where the writing table had been, the surface carrying the evidence of accumulated correspondence. Letters Lyanna wrote and burned and occasionally sent, through channels the Blackfish had built and maintained, to places that required no explanation. The carving was still in the wall. 3 words, the stone around them dark with candle soot. Lyanna was 32 years old. She was at the window when Catelyn came in, the alcove's narrow shaft of light, the one opening in the room that showed sky. She stood in it the way she always stood in it, with the economical stillness of a person who had learned to take a small thing seriously. "How long?" she said. "A fortnight, perhaps 3 weeks." Catelyn kept her voice even. "The royal children will be with him. It will not be a short visit." Lyanna turned from the window. In the candlelight she looked, as she often looked, more Stark than ever. The angles had sharpened with age, the gray of her eyes gone harder. She was nothing like the 16-year-old in the tower. She was nothing like the songs either. She was something the songs had never accounted for. The version of Lyanna Stark that had survived. That had sat in a room beneath the castle for 15 years, reading everything she could find and thinking without interruption about everything she had read. "He'll go to the crypts," she said. "He always does, when he visits." A pause. "And the statue." Yes, Lyanna said nothing for a long moment. She looked at the carving in the wall. Her hand did not go to it. She had stopped doing that somewhere around year 7. "Move me tonight," she said. "I'll be ready." The Wolf's Wood Holdfast was 2 hours' ride through pine and frozen ground, and Catelyn had ridden it in full dark on 3 previous occasions. 2 visits from southern lords who asked too many questions, and once when a persistent Lannister envoy had requested a tour of the castle's eastern wing. She knew the route. The Holdfast was warm enough, provisioned enough, defensible enough. She did not like leaving Lyanna there. She went back to Winterfell before dawn and spent the next 12 days doing what she always did when the secret required active management, working. Sansa's lessons. Robb's correspondence. The castle accounts. The 1,000 small legible facts of a life that left no room for the one illegible one underneath it all. Robert Baratheon arrived on a gray afternoon with 200 riders and the noise of a small war. He was fatter than the last time. Ned had told her this was happening, that the king who had been a force of nature at 6 and 10 was becoming a force of gravity instead. That the body was going the way that bodies went when their owner stopped asking anything of them. She saw it when he dismounted and the yard absorbed his presence the way yards always absorbed Robert's presence, shifting toward him, recalibrating around him, and underneath the ceremony of it she could see the cost of 15 years of the throne in the set of his jaw and the particular redness around his eyes. He embraced Ned the way men embraced other men when they had been 20 years apart and had no language for what the distance had done. Too hard, too long, then immediately covering it with bluster. Then he looked at her. "Cat," he said, the nickname he had always used, as though the familiarity had been established between them instead of simply assumed. "You look exactly the same." "How in 7 hells does she look exactly the same, Ned?" "Good northern air, your grace," she said. He laughed. It was still a good laugh. She gave him that. He went to the crypts on the 2nd day. Ned went with him, as he always did, and Catelyn did not watch them go, because watching them go would have been something to notice, and she did not need anything in the next 3 weeks to be noticed. She stood at the upper window of her solar and looked at the yard instead. She thought about the statue. She had seen it many times, gone into the crypts alone in the early years, when she was still learning the dimensions of what she was keeping. The carved face was accurate, in the way that memorial art sometimes was, the bones of it correct. The expression neutralized into stone dignity that stripped out everything Lyanna had actually been. Robert had wept at it. She had heard this from Ned, told simply and without elaboration, the way Ned told things that had cost him. He was weeping at a statue. 2 hours' ride away, the woman was reading in a warm hold-fast room and waiting for the ravens that told her it was safe to come back. The feather he would place at the base, Robert always brought a feather, for reasons Ned had never explained and she had never asked, would sit at the feet of stone that was not her. The grief was real. She had never doubted that. It was simply aimed at the wrong thing, which was how grief worked when the thing you lost had never been yours to interpret. Robert made the offer on the 3rd day. Privately, in the great hall after the others had gone, just Robert and Ned and the dying fire and the kind of directness that Robert only managed when he was not yet drunk. Jon Arryn was dead, he said. He needed a hand. He needed Ned. The realm needed someone he could trust in that chair. Ned had looked at him for a long moment. Then, he said yes. Catelyn heard this when Ned came to find her afterward, told it plainly and without ceremony, which was how he delivered information he had already decided was unchangeable. She received it the same way, without visible reaction, in the way of a woman who had been managing a 17-year secret and understood that the handship now became one more thing to route around. She sat with it for a moment. Then she said, "When? He wants me to come south before the year is out. Then we have time," she said. She did not say what the time was for. Ned already knew. The near miss came on the 4th day. The Blackfish found her at noon. He came into her solar without announcing himself, which he only did when something required immediate conversation. "One of the Baratheon squires," he said, "rode out for firewood this morning. He saw a woman at the holdfast window." Catelyn set down what she was holding. He said nothing. He was at the holdfast and back before the kitchen fires were lit. He mentioned it to the stable boy as an observation, not a question. The Blackfish's voice was completely flat. This was how he delivered information that had frightened him, by removing everything from it. He has no reason to think anything of a woman at a window in the Wolfswood. Not yet. Not yet. She stood. Move her tonight. Further in, the eastern wing of the holdfast, the room without windows. She paused. And the squire. I'll know everything about the squire by this evening. He was already at the door. He always already knew what to do. That was the thing about the Blackfish that she had understood since the road south from the Red Mountains. He had built his entire life around the premise that the world required management, and management required neither panic nor sentiment. He went. She sat back down. Her hands were completely steady. The feast on the 6th night. Cersei glittered at the high table and watched everything, which was her own form of management, and which Catelyn found professionally comprehensible even when she found nothing else about the woman comprehensible. The children ate and performed. Ned and Robert drank and talked in the way that men who had been boys together talked when they were finally in the same room. Shorthand and half-sentences, the compression of a shared history that excluded everyone else. Catelyn sat 3 seats down from Robert. He turned to her during the 2nd course, when the hall was loud enough that the conversation was private. "You know what I miss most about her?" he said. He was not drunk yet. That was what made it strange, the question emerging from sobriety, which meant it had been sitting there waiting. She did not ask who he meant. "She never told me what I wanted to hear," he said. He was looking at Ned, not at Catelyn, his expression the unguarded kind that alcohol had not produced because alcohol had not started yet. "Every woman I have ever known, and I have known many women, Cat, you understand I say that without pride. Every one of them told me what I wanted to hear, because that is what you do with a man who will be king." He picked up his cup. She never did. Said the opposite, half the time, just to hear what I'd say back. Catelyn picked up her own wine. "Truly," she said, "I'd have thought she was very easy to love." He looked at her then, surprised, perhaps, that she'd engaged. "The hardest thing in the world," he said. "Hardest thing I ever tried. That's why I couldn't stop." He drank, set the cup down, looked at Ned again. He got the right one, I think. He meant it as neither compliment nor wound. He meant it as the truest thing he knew about the shape of his own life, that he had reached for the difficult one, and lost. And the man beside him had gotten the one who would stay, and that this was somehow the summary of everything that had happened between them. Catelyn held the wineglass. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said. The words came out clean and calm and completely level. They were the most dangerous words she had spoken in 15 years. Tyrion Lannister had been reading people since he was old enough to understand that he would always be read first. Being a dwarf meant entering every room as a judgment already passed. The only useful response he had ever found was to become very good at passing judgments of his own. 24 years of practice. He was not modest about the results. Winterfell was interesting. Not the castle itself, which was gray and enormous and warm in the volcanic spring way that struck northerners as miraculous and struck Tyrion only as competent engineering. Not Robert, who was the same at Winterfell as everywhere else, large, loud, grief-soaked in ways he had never learned to name. Not Cersei, who watched everything with the particular attention of someone cataloging debts. Catelyn Stark was interesting. He noticed it on the second morning, in the yard. She was crossing toward the armory. Jon Snow was crossing from the stables. They intersected at the center of the yard at the angle that accidental geometry produced in working castles. Not designed, not avoided. She adjusted her path in the lateral way that people adjusted paths when they were managing a relationship in public, rather than simply navigating one. He watched her look at the boy. He had been told the story. Everyone had been told the story. Ned Stark's bastard, the boy from Starfall, the child Catelyn Stark had accepted with the gracious tolerance that well-bred ladies extended to their husbands' indiscretions when there was no other option. The framework was tidy. The framework was complete. She did not look at Jon Snow like that. She looked at him the way his father looked at documents he had spent considerable effort producing and was now monitoring for correct execution. Nothing in the expression resembled pain. Nothing resembled resentment or tolerance or gracious anything. It had, instead, the quality of careful attention, the monitoring gaze of someone observing a long-running arrangement for signs of deviation. Tyrion filed this under interesting and went to breakfast. Winterfell had a small library. Not impressive. But northern lords had been keeping records for 8,000 years, and 8,000 years of records accumulated, and the room that held them was, while not large, considerably more interesting than its reputation suggested. He found the Tully letter on the third day. Not hidden. Simply old, filed in the correspondence bundles from the early years of Ned Stark's lordship, tucked between two more recent documents in a way that suggested it had been reviewed at some point and replaced without ceremony. A single page. A household accounting letter from Riverrun to Winterfell, dated the 4th month of 283 AC, noting the dispatch of various servants and supplies to address Lady Catelyn's requirements during what was described as a period of recovery. One line. Maester Rowan, physician of the household, dispatched south per Lady Catelyn's personal instruction, 3rd month of the year, his personal ledger to be sealed upon return pending Lord Tully's review, by order of Lady Catelyn. Tyrion read it twice. Rowan, a physician. Dispatched south, specifically the 3rd month of 283 AC. The last year of the rebellion. The year Robert took the throne. The year the Tower of Joy concluded its famous chapter. Ned Stark riding home with his sister's bones and the grief of a man who had arrived too late. He set the letter back precisely where he had found it. A sealed ledger was always interesting. A sealed ledger belonging to a physician dispatched south in haste, by a woman who had no official position in her husband's household and no obvious reason to be dispatching anyone anywhere. That was something more specific than interesting. That was a thread. He went to find Jon Snow. This required no engineering. Jon Snow was on his way to the Wall, his bastard status making any other future approximate and provincial, and he had the quality of a young man looking, without knowing it, for conversation with people who seemed to have developed a perspective on being underestimated. Tyrion had built a small reputation for this. Jon Snow was intelligent. Careful in the specific way of someone who had spent years practicing a particular form of social navigation, making sure the correct version of a relationship was visible at all times. Most people learned carefulness from fear. This was different. This carefulness had structure to it. Architecture, Lady Stark, Tyrion said, dropped it conversationally into a pause in the discussion. Not an accusation. Just a name. Jon went still. Not long. Half a breath. She has been fair to me, he said. The word landed with the weight of something chosen to replace several more accurate words. Fair, Tyrion said, given the circumstances. Bastards in someone else's household rarely get fair. He picked up his wine. I would know. I have spent my life as a bastard inside my own household, which is at least geographically convenient. Jon looked at him with the gray eyes that were entirely his father's gray and said nothing. She does not seem to resent you, Tyrion said. Gently, as an observation, not a conclusion. A pause. Short, exactly the length of a pause where something was being considered and then deliberately set aside. No, Jon said. She doesn't. He offered nothing further. He looked toward the fire with the expression of someone concluding a conversation correctly. No clatter of obvious deflection, no rudeness, just a clean end, as though the subject had been addressed to its correct depth and any further discussion would be a different kind of conversation entirely. Tyrion looked at the fire too. That, right there. That was not the behavior of a boy navigating a woman's resentment. That was the behavior of a boy who had been taught how to conduct himself in a specific woman's presence, who understood that the correct conduct mattered in a way he had never been told directly, but had absorbed so completely it had become instinct. You did not learn that carefulness from someone who resented you. You learned it from someone who was protecting you. He saw the old man at the wall. He had gone north partly out of genuine curiosity. 800 feet of ancient ice was the kind of thing a man who read books owed himself the experience of, and partly because Robert had made it gently clear that Tyrion's continued presence at Winterfell was surplus to requirements. Ned had accepted the handship, which meant King's Landing in the coming months, which meant Tyrion would find his own way south eventually. For now, the wall. The Watch was what the Watch always was. Murderers, thieves, the accidentally unlucky, and the deliberately disgraced. He had prepared remarks about the honor of their service that were perhaps 30% sincere. He saw the old man the morning after his arrival. White hair. The posture of someone whose spine had been stood at formal attention so many times that it had simply retained the shape as a default. He was moving crates in the yard, coordinating some piece of the Watch's endless logistical maintenance, with the quiet efficiency of a body trained for considerably more than crate moving, and now bringing that same precision to whatever was currently required. Tyrion watched from the gallery. Criminals moved in specific ways. The aggressive economy of men who had learned that violence was the fastest solution to most problems. The hunched efficiency of men who had learned that being noticed cost them. This man had neither. He had the contained, inward authority of someone who was not afraid of anything, and never had been, who had moved through his entire life in the knowledge that whatever room he walked into, he was the most dangerous thing in it, and who had made peace with that knowledge so long ago that it no longer required expression. He had read the histories. He thought, there is something Kingsguard about this man. He said it to no one. He had a posture and a gut instinct and the feeling of two pieces of a puzzle moving toward each other in the back of his mind. No proof. No names. Just the shape of a thing he could not yet see fully. He watched the old man cross the yard and disappear through a door without looking at anyone. White hair. Iron spine. Absolute economy of motion. He went back to his quarters. He wrote the letter to himself that night. His own shorthand, the notation system he had developed at 10 years old and never taught to anyone. No one had ever broken it. Probably no one had ever tried. 4 lines. Tower of Joy. Physician dispatched south, 3rd month, 283 AC. Ledger sealed on Lady Catelyn's personal order. Jon Snow's manner around the lady. Wrong for resentment, right for management. Old man. The wall. Kingsguard bearing. White hair. Age consistent. He stopped, looked at the flame, added a 5th line. What did Catelyn Tully find in the Red Mountains? He folded the letter. He did not send it. He had no one to send it to, not yet, not without more pieces, not without the specific thing that turned a series of observations into something he could build an argument around. He tucked it into the inner lining of his doublet and extinguished the candle. Outside, The wind came off the darkness beyond the wall, the vast flat silence of the true north, the part of the world that did not acknowledge human arrangements, that had been there before every secret ever kept, and would be there after every secret was finally told. He lay in the dark and thought about physicians and sealed ledgers, and the specific quality of a young man's carefulness. He thought about a statue in a crypt with a feather at its feet. He thought about the shape of what he did not know yet, which was always more interesting than the shape of what he did. He went to sleep, Ned told him at dawn. Not much. That was the Stark way, not cruelty but compression, the understanding that excessive preamble was a form of disrespect toward the person being prepared. There was someone in the Wolfswood he should meet, a woman. She had something to tell him that could only be told in person, and that Jon should hear before the household woke and the day made its demands. Jon looked at his father. Ned looked back at him with the expression he used when he was holding something that had weight, not hiding it exactly, but containing it. The way you contained a fire that needed to keep burning, without burning everything around it. "Go today," Ned said. "Take Ghost. Take no one else." That was all. The Wolfswood in morning was pine and frozen ground, and the silence of a place that had been there before language and would be there after. Ghost moved without sound at his left side, 3 stone of white direwolf that had, since the earliest days, maintained the specific proximity of a creature that understood more about its person's emotional state than its person was comfortable with. Jon rode without thinking about where he was going. He thought instead about the pattern of the past 2 months, the quiet changes in the household's atmosphere, the conversations that stopped or redirected when he entered rooms. His father's manner going incrementally interior in a way that was different from the usual Ned Stark interiority. Something had been building. He had felt it without being able to name it. He was a bastard. He had been a bastard for 16 years, which was long enough to understand exactly how much the word contained and exactly how little it explained. It explained nothing about why Lady Stark looked at him the way she did, not like pain, not like resentment, like something he had never found the right word for. It explained nothing about the quality of his father's silences when the subject of Jon's future arose. It was a category, not an answer. The holdfast appeared through the trees. Small, stone, older than the main castle, rougher, built for function by people who had no interest in anything else. Ghost stopped at the door. He did not go further. He simply stopped, sat, and looked at Jon with the yellow eyes that always made people uncomfortable, and had made Jon uncomfortable too, until he had understood that the wolf saw things correctly, and Jon was the one whose vision was limited. He went inside alone. The room was warm. A fire in the stone hearth. A table. 2 chairs. On the table, a candle, burned low, and a cup, and a book lying face down that had not been what it appeared to be a moment ago. The woman was standing at the window. She turned when he entered. He stopped. She was perhaps 30. Perhaps more. Dark-haired, going slightly at the temples toward something lighter. She was lean in the way Northerners were lean, not fashioned, but functional. The frame of someone who moved through cold as a daily condition. Her eyes, in the thin morning light from the window, were gray. His gray. Not similar. Not the same shade. Identical in the specific way that eyes that came from the same source were identical. The particular distribution of dark and light in the iris, the exact weight of the gaze. He had been looking at his father's gray eyes his whole life. He knew them. These were not his father's. He stood in the doorway for a long time. She did not move toward him. She did not speak. She let him look at her the way you let a person stand at the edge of something significant and find their own footing. He came inside and sat down. She sat across from him. "I am Lyanna Stark," she said. He had prepared, on the ride through the Wolfswood, for several possible versions of this conversation. He was 16 and intelligent, and he had been turning over the pieces of his own life since he was old enough to understand there were pieces that didn't fit. He had not prepared for this. He sat with it for a moment. The name. The fact. The living woman in a chair 3 feet from him. "I know who you are," he said. His voice came out even. He was Ned Stark's son. He had learned, or absorbed, or been trained into the ability to hear large things without his face announcing them to the room. He looked at her. "He told you I was dead." she said. It was not a question. Everyone told me you were dead. He paused. Your statue is in the crypts. I know. She looked at the fire, briefly. I've never seen it. Silence. The wood in the hearth settled. She looked back at him. Your father, she said. Rhaegar Targaryen. 3 words. Jon heard them. He held them in the part of his mind that was built for holding large and structurally significant things in understanding, with complete clarity. That the holding was going to take time and the understanding was going to arrive in pieces over the following days and years, rather than all at once in this room. He was aware of this. He made room for it. He made no other response. She watched him. Something moved through her expression, not surprise. She had expected this. She had thought, maybe, about what he would be. She had had 16 years to think about it. Your name, she said, the name your father chose, was Aegon. He heard that too. Aegon Targaryen, he said quietly, the last son of the last dragon. Her voice did not perform this. She said it as the fact it was. The legitimate heir to the Iron Throne by blood, by the marriage your father and I entered freely, and by every law of succession that existed before Robert Baratheon sat down on the swords of the people he defeated. She paused. Your father had his marriage to Elia Martell dissolved by the High Septon before he wed me. The record exists. The seal is intact. The legitimacy is not a claim. It is a fact. Jon looked at the fire. He thought about the throne. He thought about King's Landing. He thought about Robert, who he had met, and who he had watched in the yard and at the table and in the crypts, where the man had pressed a feather against a stone floor, and been so specific in his grief that it had looked, from the gallery, less like love and more like a wound he had been reopening on schedule for 15 years. How, he said. She told him. The tower. The fever. The physician from Riverrun. The 3 Kingsguard standing in the courtyard with nowhere left to point their purpose. The woman who had ridden 3 weeks into the Red Mountains with a sealed jar of Tully honey and a quiet, radical certainty that some problems could be solved if the right person arrived with the right equipment before the situation became irreversible. Jon listened. He was very still. This was not performance. It was the Stark thing, the deep water quality of a temperament that processed rather than reacted, that held things down in some structural interior until they were understood well enough to surface safely. Ghost was outside doing the same thing, in a wolf's terms. When she finished, the fire had gone lower. She carried me out, he said. She had been holding you for 2 days by then. He looked at the table, at the burned-down candle, at his own hands. She chose to tell you. She said it quietly. I want to be exact about this. I chose that this conversation should happen. But I did not choose its timing without her. We discussed it. She told me the South was moving, that the time for the secret being fully secret was ending, that you should hear this from me, not from an enemy who found a piece of it and built a weapon. Jon was quiet. Does Lady Stark know you're telling me? He said. Today, now, Lyanna almost smiled. Almost the very edge of it, the fractional shift of expression on the face of a woman who had spent 16 years in a heated alcove beneath a castle, learning the precise difference between the thing that would be a smile in a normal life and the thing that was available in this one. She told me to, she said. He rode back through the Wolfswood as the day went to afternoon. Ghost ran alongside, occasionally ahead, occasionally behind, the direwolf's movement through the trees carrying the specific quality of a creature for whom the information the wind provided was sufficient orientation in all things. Jon rode without thinking. Not because there was nothing to think about, because there was too much, and it was all true. And it would take the rest of his life to understand what to do with it. He had found the edge of the thing and looked over, and the thing was real and enormous, and he was going to need considerably more time. He found Catelyn Stark alone in her solar. She was at her sewing, the careful, methodical work she brought out when she needed her hands occupied and her mind free. She did not look surprised when he appeared in the doorway. She looked up with the expression he had been reading his whole life without knowing how to name it. He understood it now. He stood in the doorway for a long moment. Thank you, he said. She looked at him across the solar. She set the sewing down. Don't thank me yet. Her voice was level and entirely serious. The hard part hasn't started. He nodded. He was his mother's son, and his father's son, and hers in the only way that mattered, the way built from choice rather than blood, the way that had been constructed deliberately in the dark over 16 years, by a woman with a jar of honey and the specific refusal to accept that some problems could not be solved. He left her to her sewing. Ghost was waiting at the bottom of the stairs. The ravens went out in the dark, not all at once. That was the Blackfish's design, the specific, unhurried patience of a military mind that had learned, across 30 years of war and politics and the management of an impossible secret, that speed was not always the point. Speed drew attention. Sequence was what you wanted. The right message to the right house at the right moment, so that by the time any piece of it could be betrayed to the south, the whole architecture had already been built, and the betrayal was too late. Howland Reed first. The Crannogmen were already his. They had been his since the Trident, since the Tower of Joy, since a small man with a frog spear had put a blade through Arthur Dayne's side and then watched the man who stopped him from finishing it hold that secret for 17 years. Reed's testimony was the oldest proof in the world. He had been there. He had seen Lyanna Stark alive. He had watched Catelyn Tully walk out of a tower with a living child that the realm believed did not exist. He came to Winterfell himself. He was small and mud-colored and entirely unremarkable, and he walked into Catelyn's solar and sat down and said, "It's time then, it's time," she said. He nodded once and went to find Jon. The Blackfish rode for Riverrun. He was 63 years old, and he rode like a man of 40, and he arrived at his brother's seat Hoster long dead, Edmure now lord, perpetually uncertain in the way that men who grew up in the shadow of their relative certainty were uncertain, and he sat Edmure down and told him everything. Not gently. The Blackfish did not do things gently. Edmure went pale and then red, and then pale again, and said several things that were not useful. The Blackfish waited for all of them to finish. Then he said, "The Tully bannermen will follow your aunt's lead. Your aunt built this. Your job is to open the gates." Edmure opened the gates. The Mallister at Seaguard followed. The Pipers. The Rhaegars. The Freys hesitated, because the Freys always hesitated when they suspected they might be on the losing side, and then they looked at what was assembling and stopped hesitating. The Riverlands came home. Catelyn wrote to her sister. Lysa Arryn had been in the Eyrie since the death of Jon Arryn, increasingly strange, increasingly sealed away. The Vale under her regency becoming a thing that watched the rest of the realm from a high, cold distance and made no commitments. She was not the woman Catelyn had grown up beside, but she was still a Tully. The letter was 4 pages long. It contained everything: the tower, the physician, the child, 17 years beneath a castle, the proof and the witnesses and the shape of what was coming. Catelyn wrote it in a single sitting. She did not ask Lysa to decide. She told her what was true. She told her what the Vale would be stepping into if it chose to stand aside. Then she stopped writing. The reply came in 6 days. 1 line. "The Vale stands with House Stark." That was all. Tywin Lannister sent a letter. Not the one he had written to himself in his quarters at the Wall. That letter he had burned in the spring, when the ravens from the north began carrying news that matched the shape of what he'd suspected, and made further suspicion irrelevant. The letter he sent was to Catelyn Stark. 4 pages, compact, in the shorthand she could not read, except for the last page, which was in plain common, and which said only, "I have known since Winterfell. I am writing to you, rather than to my father. I trust you understand what that means." She read it twice. Then she wrote back. 4 lines. The last one read, "When this is concluded, come to Winterfell. I will make the introduction myself." He came. He was smaller than Jon had expected, and sharper than Jon had prepared for, and the first thing he said, sitting across a table in the solar where Catelyn Stark had built and maintained a 17-year secret, was, "I want you to know that I worked most of it out from a Tully household accounting letter and a physician's sealed ledger. I want you to know that, because I think it speaks well of the level of work that went into this." He paused. The man at the wall with the Kingsguard bearing. That was a guess. Was I right? "Yes," Catelyn said. Hightower? Yes, Tyrion nodded slowly. He turned his cup in his hands. I burned the letter I wrote to myself, in the spring when I understood which way this was going. He looked at Jon across the table. I am a Lannister, which means in your court I will be regarded with the specific suspicion that name deserves. I am not here to argue against it. He set the cup down. I am here because the person who built this was more thorough than anyone I have encountered in my life, and I would like very much to not be her enemy. He looked at Catelyn when he said the last part. She held his gaze for a moment. You're not, she said. The revelation happened in Winterfell's great hall. 200 lords and bannermen of the north called to Winterfell for a gathering whose stated purpose was the matter of the southern roads and their maintenance during winter. They had all come. They were northern lords. When the Stark called, they came. Jon stood at the front of the hall. He was 16 years old, and he carried himself the way people carried themselves when they had been told the truth about their own weight. Not performance, not the stiffness of someone unused to being looked at, but the settled, grounded quality of someone who understood what they were standing on. He named himself. He said his father's name. He said his mother's name. He said the name he had been given in a tower in the Red Mountains by a woman who understood that the name that kept you alive was worth more than the name that was true. And then he said the name that was true. Aegon Targaryen. The hall was completely still. Then the door at the far end opened, and Lyanna Stark walked in. She was 32 years old. She walked through the great hall of the castle she had grown up in and had lived beneath for 17 years, and she walked without ceremony, without the pomp that would have accompanied any staged entrance, because ceremony was not what the moment required. What it required was the simple, undeniable fact of her, alive, upright, gray-eyed, looking like the North itself. People recognized her. Not from the statue. The statue was stone dignity, the smoothed-out version, the memorial face. They recognized her from the bones of her, from Ned, who was standing at the side of the hall with the contained expression of a man who had been holding something for 17 years and was only now setting it down. From Jon, who was her. The resemblance that had been visible in the dark to a sharp observer in a dim corridor was catastrophically visible here, in the full light, with both of them in the same room. She stopped at the center of the hall. She did not speak. She didn't need to. Howland Reed came forward with the documents, the letter in Rhaegar's hand, the marriage witnessed in a Dornish sept. The High Septon's annulment record with its seal intact. 3 maesters had examined them that morning without being told whose hand had written them, and had identified all 3 independently. Reed set them on the table. The lords of the north looked at Jon Snow. They saw the boy who had grown up among them, who had sat at their tables and ridden with their sons and stood in the cold at Winterfell since before most of them could place a date to it. He was not a foreign thing. He was not silver and fire in the alien south. He was Ned Stark's face, and Lyanna Stark's eyes, and the North's particular blend of silence and endurance. And he was standing in the great hall of Winterfell with proof of his blood and the wolves of the Stark house at his back. The first man to kneel was the Lord of Bear Island. Then the Karstarks, the Mormonts, the Umbers who did nothing quietly, going to one knee with the sound of metal on stone. The hall followed, not all at once, not uniformly, with the specific roughness of proud people making a decision they were making because they had decided to, not because they had been swept into it. The North remembered. It always had. The war lasted 7 months. The Blackfish described it afterward as the most straightforward military campaign he had conducted since the age of 30, by which he meant that he had numerical advantage, righteous cause, and the particular benefit of fighting against a faction whose generals were compromised by the political survival instincts of the woman directing them from King's Landing. Cersei Lannister was many things. She was not a commander. The Lannister forces that marched north were well equipped and well supplied and organized by men who understood logistics, and they met the combined North Riverlands Vale at the God's Eye, and they lost. They regrouped below the Trident, and they lost again. They fell back to King's Landing, and they looked at what was coming, and Cersei looked at her children and made the calculation that every parent makes, when the alternative to surrender is the thing she had built her entire life to prevent happening to her children. She opened the gates. The Blackfish rode in at the front of the column with the expression of a man who had been waiting his entire adult life for the specific satisfaction of this exact moment. Robert was found in the Tower of the Hand. Not hiding, he was sitting in a chair by the window with a cup that was empty and had been empty for some time, looking out at the city he had ruled for 17 years. When the door opened, he did not reach for a weapon. He looked at the person who had come in, and then he looked away again at the window. He had been told an hour before. Someone had told him, in the kind of plain, straightforward language that the Blackfish used for important information, that Lyanna Stark was alive and had been alive for 17 years, and that the boy he had drunk with at the feast and watched in the yard and thought was Ned's bastard was in fact Ned's nephew and Rhaegar Targaryen's son, and the rightful heir to the throne Robert currently occupied. He had sat down. He had been sitting down since. Lyanna walked into the room alone. No guard. No ceremony. She closed the door. He turned from the window. He looked at her across the room for a long time. He tried, once, to speak. The word, whatever it was going to be, did not arrive. He tried again. Nothing. He looked like a man whose legs had stopped working, which was why he was already sitting down. She crossed the room. She sat in the chair across from him. She looked at him, at the wreckage of the man he had been at 20, at the distance between what he had dreamed her to be and what she was and had always been. "You built a kingdom on a grave, Robert," she said. Her voice was quiet and completely without cruelty. "I'm afraid it was always an empty one." He said nothing. He sat in the chair by the window of a tower in a city he had ruled for 17 years over the grief of a woman who was sitting 3 feet from him, and he had absolutely nothing left to say. He looked old. He looked like a man who had spent every remaining year of his life in the future he had already been living in, the dissolution and the hunting and the long forgetting, and had arrived at its end a decade early in an afternoon in a chair, without the war he would have preferred, because war at least had the dignity of motion. He put his face in his hands. Lyanna looked at the window. Outside, King's Landing moved. It did not know what had happened yet. It would know by morning. It would adjust, because cities adjusted, because the people in them needed to eat and sleep and move from one part of their lives to the next, regardless of what the people in towers above them were doing. She sat with him until the light went. Then she stood. She did not say anything further. There was nothing further to say. The account was settled. Not evenly. It was never going to be even, but settled. The grave he had built his kingdom on had turned out to contain no one, and what it contained instead was 17 years of a woman living and reading and carving words in stone and waiting for the world to become something it could survive her being in. She had survived. She walked to the door. She walked out into the corridor where the Blackfish was waiting, and the Blackfish looked at her. And she said, "We're done here." He nodded. They went downstairs. Jon Snow, Aegon Targaryen, was crowned in the great sept of Baelor on a morning in the first week of spring. Catelyn Stark stood in the front of the sept and watched the crown placed on the head of the child she had carried out of a tower in the Red Mountains of Dorne when he was 3 days old. Beside her, Tyrion Lannister stood with his hands folded and his expression carefully neutral, which for him was the equivalent of anyone else weeping openly. She did not weep. She was a Tully of Riverrun, and she had built the things she was watching, and building things was its own complete satisfaction, and the watching of them standing was enough. Outside, the city cheered. Inside the sept, Jon Aegon looked at her across the space. She looked back. The north is cold and full of whispers, and some whispers, it turns out, were never whispers at all. Let me know what you'd like to see next. The end.